Welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're joining me today. Just think about this for a second. Anatomically modern humans have been around for roughly 300,000 years, right? But we only figured out how to actually make swords about 4,000 years ago. For almost our entire existence, humanity relied on really simple stone tools. But the discovery of metal, well, it completely transformed not just how we fought, but the very trajectory of human civilization itself. So today, we're going to trace that incredible journey, all the way from glowing ancient furnaces to magnificent blades that became the ultimate symbols of power and honor.
Okay, let's dive into this. I want you to imagine a world long before metal. You're in a life-or-death situation. You're defending your territory, and your primary weapon is just a sharp flint dagger, or maybe a stone-headed club. You swing, you strike your opponent's weapon, and crack. Your only line of defense literally shatters into a dozen pieces. That terrifying vulnerability was just the everyday reality for thousands of years. Early humans desperately needed a solution to this fatal flaw in their technology.
So to understand exactly how we solved that problem, here is our historical roadmap. First, we'll look at before the first sword. Then, the bronze breakthrough. Next, the iron and steel revolutions. After that, how the sword became more than a weapon. And finally, unearthing the past.
Section 1. Before the first sword. The limits of stone.
Before swords existed, the human arsenal was highly practical, for sure, but it was incredibly basic. Early humans relied heavily on things like stone hand axes, wooden clubs, sharp flint daggers, and spears. Now, don't get me wrong here. These were highly effective tools if you were hunting wild animals or just needed some basic defense. But when it came down to organized human conflict, they carried a critical, fatal limitation that really held back the evolution of warfare.
And that limitation? Well, it all comes down to the fundamental physics of the materials. Stone has one major, glaring weakness. It is incredibly fragile under lateral stress. It chips, it cracks, and it breaks. If you try to make a long cutting weapon out of stone, it's just going to snap the exact moment it hits something hard. Humanity faced this desperate engineering problem. They needed a material that was harder, stronger, and durable enough to support a long, continuous blade without shattering on impact. Basically, they needed metal.
Section 2. The bronze breakthrough. The discovery of metal.
Imagine the heat, the smoke, and just the raw ingenuity of the early Bronze Age. Humans figured out that pure copper was actually a bit too soft, but if you combine it with tin, you get bronze, a material that is so much harder, stronger, and way easier to shape. The ancient blacksmith would heat and melt these metals in glowing furnaces, pour that molten alloy directly into carved stone molds, and then painstakingly polish the finished piece. So the crucial point is, for the very first time in human history, this specific process made long, highly durable blades a physical reality. The sword had finally arrived.
Let's move to our historical timeline and see how this builds. Around 3300 BCE, humans first begin to create bronze, but it takes time to actually refine the engineering. It really isn't until about 1700 BCE that we see the earliest known swords physically appearing in the archaeological record. And then, as we'll see shortly, around 1200 BCE, humanity masters a totally new material, iron, which just shifts the entire paradigm all over again. Let's zero in on those very first swords from 1700 BCE, found in places like Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean world. When we hear the word sword, we usually picture these massive, sweeping, broad swords, right? But these early weapons were surprisingly short, often measuring only 50 to 70 centimeters in length. You had to get dangerously close to your enemy to actually use one of these things. Because metallurgy was still pretty much in its infancy, these blades were compact, designed primarily as thrusting weapons, though they could do a bit of slashing in close-quarters combat. As metalworking techniques got better, the blades slowly became longer, stronger, and much more balanced.
It's also super vital to understand exactly who was carrying these early weapons. A bronze sword? That wasn't something your common foot soldier was carrying around. Bronze itself was an incredibly valuable commodity. Because of the sheer expense of sourcing copper and tin, these swords were strictly elite weapons. They were beautifully crafted, often intricately carved and decorated with gold and ivory. For ancient kings and nobles, owning a bronze sword became the ultimate, undeniable symbol of military authority and absolute power.
Section 3. Iron and steel revolutions. Mass production and perfection. Around 1200 BCE, warfare changes forever. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast in economics. The Bronze Era relied on incredibly rare, expensive materials. keeping swords restricted to the wealthy elite. But iron is vastly more abundant in the Earth's crust. Mastering iron meant weapons became drastically cheaper to produce. Even though early iron swords weren't always vastly superior to a really well-made bronze one, the sheer abundance of iron meant you could suddenly arm a massive, widespread military force. It completely democratized warfare.
But then we hit the ultimate upgrade. Blacksmiths eventually discovered this monumental metallurgical secret that would literally change the world. If you add small, highly precise amounts of carbon to iron during the forging process, you create steel. Steel swords were suddenly tougher, sharper, and immensely more durable than anything that had ever existed on the planet before. A real game changer.
And with steel on the scene, we see this absolute explosion of incredible, legendary craftsmanship across the globe. From the curved blades of the Persians to the double-edged straight swords of medieval Europeans, civilizations everywhere took this technology and just ran with it. The Greeks, the Romans, Indians, Chinese, each of these cultures developed their own legendary sword designs that were perfectly suited to their own unique, specific styles of warfare and martial arts.
Section 4. More than a weapon. The cultural impact.
Over the centuries, the sword really transcended its brutal origins on the battlefield to become this profound spiritual and cultural symbol. And this brilliantly illustrates just how universal the symbolism became. Kings were crowned alongside ceremonial swords to represent justice and leadership. Medieval knights swore sacred oaths right upon the hilts of their swords. In Japan, the samurai considered the katana to be the literal soul of the warrior. Even today, in our era of incredibly advanced modern warfare, military ceremonies still prominently feature swords as these enduring symbols of honor, tradition, and courage.
Section 5. Unearthing the past, the legacy. Even today, modern archaeologists are still pulling these incredible artifacts out of the earth, finding them buried deep in rivers, ancient tombs, old battlefields, and royal graves. And what's truly staggering to me is the age of some of these discoveries. We are finding swords that are over 3,500 years old, yet they remain remarkably well preserved. It's just a breathtaking testament to the advanced craftsmanship of our ancestors. When you see these weapons behind glass in a museum, it's pretty easy to just view them as, old pieces of metal. But they are so much more than that. These swords prove that ancient civilizations possess this extraordinary, highly complex knowledge of metallurgy. Every single recovered sword tells a visceral, deeply human story about the specific people who painstakingly forged it over an open fire, the warriors who actually carried it, and the desperate, history-shaping battles they fought.
So, from humble bronze blades to magnificent steel weapons, the sword shaped empires and inspired incredible legends. While firearms have long since replaced them on the battlefield, no weapon has ever captured the human imagination quite like the sword. As this quote beautifully states, a recovered sword is a silent witness to thousands of years of human history. It forces us to ask ourselves, when future archaeologists dig up the artifacts of our modern world thousands of years from now, what single invention of ours will stand out as the ultimate symbol of our civilization's power, ingenuity, and spirit? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I'll see you next time.